Let's say a backpacker is hiking 25 miles a day and needs something around 5,000 calories. Now, that backpacker has to carry all their food. So the question is, which food item is going to give them the most calories for the weight? And I have some things listed here. To answer this question, you're going to need to think about how many calories per gram and what kind of organic molecules will you find in things like milk, apples, peanut butter, and steak. In the case of milk, you're going to find lactose, which is a disaccharide, a double sugar. Apples will have a lot of water, and they'll have a lot of simple sugars. Peanut butter is going to have a significant amount of fat as well as some protein, whereas steak is going to be purely protein. Remember that carbohydrates and protein only have 4 calories per gram. Fats have 9 calories per gram. So the most calories for the weight in this case is going to be peanut butter. This brings up the idea of nutrition and how we can use the information we've learned about organic molecules to help us make better choices about our food. When you look at the food guide pyramid, you'll notice it's divided into things like grains and vegetables and fruits and milk. It's not divided into things like carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. You ever wonder why? The answer lies somewhere in the idea that carbohydrates, fats, and proteins can be found in many different types of foods. Whereas if you're just trying to categorize food, it's easier to put them into categories like grains and vegetables and fruits. You can see that the food guide pyramid has a certain percent of your diet should be grains. So if you're on a 2,000 calorie diet and you're closer to the middle, let's say, then it shows you the relative percent of those calories which should be from those different food sources. If you have 2,500 calories, let's say, and you're closer to the bottom of the food guide pyramid, you can see that the percentages don't really change, although the number of calories for those food groups will change. Just a quick kind of easy way to remember like how much of your diet should be carbohydrates, fats, or proteins. A typical diet might be 50% carbohydrates, 20 protein, 30 fat. Another option or breakdown might be 60% carbohydrates, 20 protein, 20 fat. What does 200 calories even look like? Notice again, 200 calories of fat is not very much, whereas 200 calories of a vegetable is considerably more. Again, because fruits and vegetables contain a lot of water, you get a lot more substance, but also they contain cellulose, fiber, food, like the carbohydrate that we can't digest. So you can feel more full by eating fruits and vegetables. Carbohydrates are broken down into 2 major categories: complex carbohydrates and simple carbohydrates. Remember, carbohydrates consist of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and we use carbohydrates for energy. We break those chemical bonds from complex carbohydrates to simple carbohydrates, and that's how we get that energy to be released. We find carbohydrates in things like fruits, vegetables, and grains. Here's kind of a quick, easy way to get an idea of portion sizes. In our country, portion sizes are greatly exaggerated. But to get an idea of what does it mean to have a serving, when you think about a serving of meat, you should be thinking about the size of the palm of your hand. When you're thinking about a serving of vegetables, it should be about the size of your fist, like piled up on your plate. When you're thinking about servings of salad dressing or butter, you should be thinking about the top section of your thumb. Kind of gives you a rough idea of what a serving size might look like. Here we have several different types of cheeses. And these advertisements are identifying these cheeses as low-carb foods, which can have some pros, but also notice that there's a significant amount of fat. Now, sometimes we confuse the word lipid and fats. All right, fats are made up of triglycerides, those fatty acids. That's how we get the name fats. But lipids could be other things. All right, so triglycerides, like the saturated fat that we find here, is going to be solid at room temperature. Triglycerides that are unsaturated fats are oils. They're going to be liquid at room temperature. Fats and lipids are made up of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, but the difference is that there's a different ratio between carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens with fats compared to with carbohydrates. Now, we use triglycerides to store energy, long-term energy storage. We also use it in things like phospholipids for cell membranes, and even things like cholesterol and steroids for hormones. The way you recognize an unsaturated fat is there's a double bond and a bent chain, and that's going to make that fat hard to pack together, and so because it's going to be more loosely packed, it's going to be liquid at room temperature. So if you take a look at a food, you need to be able to recognize, well, we expect to see things like carbohydrates, fats, or proteins. Those are going to be on every label. So in the case of a steak, we'd expect to see mostly protein. Remember, proteins are made up of amino acids. There's 20 different kinds of amino acids, and some of those amino acids are essential, some are non-essential. So our body uses those proteins for all kinds of things: growth, maintenance, and repair. We even use them for helping speed up chemical reactions. We call those proteins enzymes. So in the steak, we would expect to see a lot of protein. We would expect to see perhaps some saturated fat. We would not expect to see a lot in the way of carbohydrates. So if you take a look at the label, you can see 25 grams of protein times 4 calories per gram is going to be 100 calories just from protein. You can also see that there is some fat here, mostly saturated fat, which we expect because it's an animal product. What about bread? Well, in bread we'd expect to see a lot of carbohydrates because it's made of flour. But interestingly, bread will have some fats because in order to make it, we add oil to that flour. Well, what about something like Gatorade? If you look at the Gatorade label, you'll notice that it's significantly sugars, and most of those sugars are going to be simple sugars. Right? So it's not complex sugars. We don't expect to see any protein. There's no animal product in Gatorade. We don't expect to see any fat, but we do expect to see lots of sugar, and that's what Gatorade consists mostly of, sugar. In cereal, we would expect to see a lot of carbohydrates because it's a grain. We might find a little bit of protein, but we would not expect to see a lot of fat because, again, it's wheat or rice, and so we're not expecting to see fats and oils in something like cereal. In milk, however, we would expect to see some fat because it's an animal product. So in this case, we expect to see some saturated fat because it's an animal product. Notice this is whole milk. If you get 1% or 2%, they're reducing the amount of fat that's in the milk. We do have some carbohydrates here. Mostly that's going to be in the form of lactose. And we have some protein because it's an animal product. So there will be some amino acids found in milk. In something like chips, because it's a potato, we would expect there to be some carbohydrates. Potatoes store starch. We would also expect to see some fat because the potato chips are made by putting those potato slices into oils. We do see a little tiny bit of protein, but it's primarily going to be fat and carbohydrates. Notice there's a little bit of cellulose in potato chips. With peanut butter, we'd expect to see some carbohydrates. So we add sugar to the peanut butter to make it taste better. We'd expect to see some fats because it's based on oils, so the butter part. And we expect to see some protein from the peanut. So there is a significant amount of fat, some saturated fat. We see that there is some carbohydrates, a little bit of fiber, some added sugars, and some protein. So when you're thinking about foods, take a look at the labels and try to see, is this a food that's going to give me the carbohydrates, fats, and proteins that I need in my diet? Am I getting good sources of fat? Am I getting long-term sources of carbohydrates? Am I getting lean proteins? take a look at labels whenever you're eating your food. Is the nutrition, the vitamins and minerals, worth the calories that I'm getting from this food?